Perfect. Ooh, I like the shirt.
Oh, thank you. Oh, yes. Okay. All right.
Hi, guys. So today I'm so honored to have Dr. Ingo Lambrecht. Am I pronouncing correct? Lambrecht.
It's fine.
He is a clinical psychologist. He's an author and a shaman, and he'll be here talking to us a little bit about traditional therapy versus shamanism as a form of treating and healing psychosis. Hi, how are you? He's talking to us from Auckland, New Zealand, right?
Correct. Yes.
So, do you
It's,
live there? Have you been living there for a while?
yes, I've lived here for probably now close to 20 years.
Amazing.
I'm German. I grew up in South Africa and studied in South Africa and got my graduation there. And then here I have also engaged with the Maori shamans or tohunga. Went to one of their training and work with them at times to where appropriate for a kind of cultural integration with psychotherapy or with healing. So that's some of my background.
So, you know what? Let's just maybe start by defining what is a shaman for those that don't know.
Okay. Look, it's a concept or a term that is applied often to traditional healers of indigenous communities. It has a long history. In fact, the word came from Siberia more, and is actually based on a Vedic term "sram," which means heat up, and that might give you an indication that there's something about intensity, energy that might be involved here. And this is exactly true. What's important about defining shamanism, if very broadly, is that a shaman is not just a herbalist. In other words, is not just a doctor prescribing, but they go into altered states of consciousness or trance states to access knowledge or to apply it for healing. And this is exactly where the body and the mind and the soul of a shaman gets heated up, gets engaged with practices or technology to enter trance states. And that was part of my PhD research, is how does this actually happen and how does it progress? And I've been honored and fortunate enough to have gone through a similar training. So I would define, or I would consider shamans to be healers that access trances or altered states of the mind or consciousness that also apply herbs, but that is different from a herbalist, and they might be equally traditional, but that's the difference. The difference to a priest is that many priests will follow certain religious rules and etiquettes, but don't necessarily enter a trance state. So that's why the shaman is different to a, let's say, common religious priests, be it Christian, Muslim or Buddhist even, that this is much closer to the meditators.
So how do you define trance state? Because
okay.
I see, like, for instance, in the cover of your book, Sangoma, Trance state, the states of trance, right? So there's in the cover of the book, is that your teacher?
That is indeed my teacher, Daniel Baloy. He's a Shangaan, and he was dancing that picture is of him dancing during my graduation at his place where he graduated. So there's this lineage thing, and so in South Africa, there are schools of shamans. So it's just like in psychology, you've got psychoanalysts, CBT, various schools of thought and practices. So do you also have amongst shamans, at least in South Africa, and also in many other parts of the world where they have different lineage. And I belong to a certain lineage, Impanda Majoy, which Impanda means kind of a school. Majoy, that's the name. And he was dancing in order to access a trance state. So
So that's
trance
one of the
states,
forms of access trance state, is to
exactly,
dance.
through dance. So and what it is trance state is an altered state of consciousness, and there are many, of course, you know, from coma to hypnotic state to a dissociative state. But what we could say is that the shaman is really well trained to focus on specific trance states because they have a function to access information or to connect with ancestors. So the trance state is very specifically mastered. So when you start off training, your trance states are all over the show, if you wish. And it's a bit like meditation. When you start meditation, you know, the mind's a bit all over the show. But as you meditate more deeply, you go into regular theta state, brain state, if you wish. And so you, as a form of meditation, mindfulness is a different form of meditation where you access a different state. So
would you
in
say
my
that,
research,
I'm sorry, but would you say that when they are in trance state, they're serving as a channel for the ancestors to pass the knowledge?
yes, so some shamans would totally agree with you with that. They say they are not really the important person. The aim is to train you to become a clear vessel, to be a channel for the ancestors to come through and speak through you. So what usually happens in South African shamanism is that the Sangoma, when he dances, the voices of the ancestors will speak. So it comes through, and in most times, some of them will not know what has been said. But they're different trance states. So the channel sometimes is not aware of the words spoken. That's why you often need a community involved, because they, or the client, to pick up the reading that is actually happening, because as Sangoma, I've seen, they just don't know what's happened. So, and this is not unusual. In hypnotherapy, you can also have, partial memory, full memory, or no memory of certain states. So it's about the dissociation or the shifting of consciousness linked to memory. So it's something we don't quite understand well yet, but I think shamans all over the world are experts at shifting consciousness. And I think in the West, we have yet a lot to learn from them in that regard.
And so, for instance, ayahuasca, is that another form that shamans use to get people into shift consciousness?
Indeed. So substances is one technology to shift. So it could be, the mushrooms or LSD even, but the aim is to be functional. So it's not recreational. So in my experience with ayahuasca, they're quite intense and vivid. But when you look at, I think there's a tribe called Siona somewhere in South America, where the aim is not to just have a good time. So what if you have a trance state? That is not important. What are you going to do with it? So they climb up the vine that they visualize or see and access the plant teacher to give them knowledge. So the Sangoma equally will sometimes go into trance and know that tomorrow they'll see a patient who may need some medication for a liver problem, and that herb you will find under the following bushes or trees. So it's the whole thing. This is something that I think I want to just bring across. This is not just about entering those states for its own sake. The function is to heal or to know. So they serve the community. Or to hunt, for example, that in the indigenous communities, in the hunter-gatherer time, it's very likely shamans were used to find out in which direction the hunters needed to go to find certain prey.
Right. And then, I grew up in Brazil. My father was a spiritualist, and I grew up since a very young age watching mediums and how they worked with their mediumnity. I don't know, does that translate in English?
Yeah.
And yeah, and that was all used for a purpose to help people that were going through obsession, spiritual obsession, things like that. And that's another thing that I would like to ask you. Well, first, I'm so curious to find out what a therapist, you know, got interested, what got you interested in go from traditional therapy to South Africa to study with a shaman? Because I was listening to your one of your talks, and you said something I thought was so interesting about how sometimes the ancestors will come into your life and kind of turn it upside down in a way for you to go look for a shaman.
That is correct.
You get treated, and then you find out that in reality you are in the path of shamanism yourself.
Look, so I'm going to link that to what you said about mediums. Mediums is another form of shamanism, a more modern form, you know, because they are equally often, if you listen to their stories of beginning, they will have experiences of ancestors or people who have passed on, come to them and engage with them because they are aware that this person is able to see them or be able to hear them. And so that's often a very intense, difficult time till it gets stabilized and mastered, and then they're able to channel this more effectively. Now, if it is helpful, I may just give you a bit of a traditional understanding of how you become a Sangoma. So firstly, it's not up to you to just go up and say, oh, I'd like to be a Sangoma. You know, I just would be really cool. This is not how it happens. What happens is that the ancestors choose you. And the choice of ancestors is that they create sometimes a spiritual crisis or an illness that is maybe even a spiritual emergency that leads often the person to a Sangoma, who then reads the bones, which is a form of divination, using coins, bones on a skin of an impala or an antelope, and you throw the bones. And the person sitting in front of you does not say a word, because it's a test of capacity of the Sangoma to access trance states, to read the bones properly, to tell that client what's going on. In that way, the ancestors sometimes speak through the bones to say this person needs to go into apprenticeship, which is called the ukutwasa. And the ukutwasa is a training rather than only a healing. You master the capacity to become a channel, like you said, or the capacity to master trance states. And that, Vivian, is very different. So what happened to me is I was training I was doing my psychology training, and there was an opportunity to meet a Sangoma because we did a section called African psychology. This was in South Africa.
And just to clarify, Sangoma is another word for shaman, right?
Exactly, for South African shaman, indeed. And so I just went along out of curiosity, and he read in my bones, as they say. And he said, no, you need to become a healer. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm becoming a healer. I'm a psychotherapist, psychologist. Yep, clinical. And he said, no, you need to have become a Sangoma. And I thought, ooh. And this was in the 80s during very intense apartheid years where some people would be aware black people were forced to live in townships that were closed off at that time. Police cordons were around. And so after some reflection, I decided to actually engage with this calling, and went to, I mean, that's another long story.
If you don't mind me asking,
yep.
What was that little thought or feeling that turned you say, okay, he's right, I want to do that?
Well, because I suppose one of them is that I have, even before I studied, had a very deep interest in trance states or in spiritual practices. So for me, this was an opportunity to become involved in a spiritual practice. So it became an inner calling of this feels right, and after some meditation and wondering whether this is appropriate, and for many reasons, even in terms of danger, just because to enter those zones, if you disappear, you disappear. Police would not find you or look for you. So it wasn't without, and then trying to avoid police cordons and marches, and finding him in Soweto, where I have to say all the the street signs were taken down because they were used as washing poles. So I actually don't know how I found him. It must have been some inner guiding system that made that possible. Yeah.
And that protect you.
Yeah, possibly, exactly. So some ancestors looked after me there. So then I began to do the training, but then the situation became untenable, as I could not access Soweto, which was the township outside of Johannesburg, where he lived in Meadowlands inside of Soweto, and then the South African government stated that permanent residents also have to join the army, and I was not prepared to do that. I was not prepared to support a civil war.
Right.
So I left South Africa for Germany until Mandela was released. I went back, continued my training, and then during my PhD research, I reconnected with my teacher, and we continued the training. So we had a bit of a gap. But then in that training, which became part of my PhD research as well, I, could access these as an insider, if you wish, to talk to Sangoma or shamans about their technology of trance states and what specific trance states they accessed, and to describe it. So that's what the book is based on.
How long was the training?
Usually, my training was about 2.5 years. Some it's 3 years. It's actually quite expensive as well. So you need certain, alone the divination bones. These are bones of baboons and crocodiles, and these are and various objects. You have certain rituals you need to complete that requires again a financial input, and so then your graduation costs a few thousand, and so it's not so simple as I just pop in and just check in.
Yeah, it does not sound simple.
And traditionally, you live with a Sangoma for 2-3 years. You actually live with them. And so in one case, I was, when I was I was getting water from the river, because that's the role of the apprentice. I was walking with the women. There's often, in the traditional rural setting, there's a very strong split between male and female roles. And so I was sent off to collect water with the women, which was great, going to a river and digging up the sand, because it was a dry season, and getting water into the wheelbarrow. So it was very rural.
God, that would have been an amazing documentary.
Yes, possibly.
And so I know it's a very, I guess, complicated answer for just a short interview conversation, but generally, after meeting with a patient, do you know if this patient should be treated in a more traditional therapy style or with shamanism, and what would be the difference? Like, so this person suffers from psychosis, so he should be treated with traditional therapy versus. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does, Vivian. And it is quite an important question, and I would need time to unpack that a bit, if you don't mind. It is helpful to think about, firstly, anyway, when working in psychotherapy, that we align ourselves with what the client would need and want and wish to have. So it is not my job to tell somebody, look, you need some shamanic input. I don't do that. I also practice with many different people, and many are not interested in shamanism at all. But when working with Indigenous people, so let's say here in New Zealand, I belong to a Maori mental health service, so specifically addressing the needs for Maori. And if then somebody was psychotic or struggling with hearing voices or having very strong ideas, I would work with them, but I wouldn't just quickly throw, okay, by the way, we're just going to do some shamanic practices. That would be, I think, a very crude way of working. So firstly, I would just begin to unpack slowly. And this can take months of psychotherapy before they're ready, I think, to have a cultural input that might shift them. So this is a dialogue and a collaborative process. So for example, with one person who heard voices since she was 13, and she could hardly speak to me, but after only 9 months did I start thinking about, with her and her family, how we could resolve a kind of cultural trauma that had happened in an appropriate way. And so we went out to the cemetery where it had happened. And so these are things that are done carefully, and even with other people I've worked with Indigenous, I am very mindful to do this appropriately and respectfully. I don't know if that answers you all, but with psychosis especially. So what in certain Indigenous communities and also in the Maori community, hearing voices is not always a form of madness. It could be that your ancestors are speaking to you, and that is very distressing. But even then, not everyone who claims their ancestors are speaking to them is necessarily entering a healthy trance state.
Right.
They might be still in a psychotic trance state. So to differentiate that out is actually what many shamans also do, but I do very carefully. And it was very interesting. I was working with a psychiatric nurse, and she was also very attuned and had a skill, or kind of psychic skills. And we one day just sat together and said, yes, that person has matakita, which is a form of second sight, or if you wish, spiritual capacity or psychic abilities. And we said, that client, yes, that client thinks she has it, but isn't. So there is a discernment with this, that not every psychosis is just a wonderful spiritual emergency. This is not always the case, and sometimes it is.
And how do you define in this situation ancestors? Like how?
Okay.
Explain to us about ancestors and who they are and how do they come into the person's life.
So in many Indigenous communities, life is eternal and death is just a passage to the other side, where then there is still the capacity to have a relationship with our ancestors. And look, psychoanalytic psychotherapy is not very different. We are working often with attachment patterns of our past that are based on our ancestors, whether living or not. Right. So we are affected by our ancestors, and intergenerational trauma, if you wish, is a good example of how our ancestors affect us today. The sins of the father shall visit the son. Right. So in some ways, I see quite a strong connection between the work of the many shamans with ancestor work together with psychoanalytic work. So I don't go in there and go immediately, these are your ancestors speaking. But what can happen in rare cases, and I'm very mindful to be discerning because one can be there's a lot of flaky approaches in this area, is to also, because in my shamanic training, you test things. You don't just accept things. So what if an ancestor talks to you? They need to be specific. So for example, my teacher always challenged me. So if the ancestors are vague, tell them to be more specific. And then we can test whether the voices you hear or the ancestors you hear have told you something worthwhile. So this is not a blind belief. This is why this is not about a religious belief. This is about a practice to enter trance states, to make a connection with other beings who may have knowledge, and to access that, but to test that knowledge. So, if they say, be careful, something's going to happen on that bridge, right, okay, let's see what happens. And thank heavens I listened to that voice and avoided an accident. So I want to say to you is that there have been situations where I have been with one client where I could see an ancestor, and I just gently asked her, tell me, I'm a bit puzzled, and she is Maori, so dark-skinned, black hair. I see a elderly man who's got red hair. And she says, how did you know my grandfather was Irish? And we began to then explore what's the difference between an ancestor voice versus a critical psychotic voice.
Right.
And so that discernment became important for her to begin to not assume that every voice is bad, but to know then what's an ancestor voice and what isn't. And so, equally when she could see the dead in bus stops, I'd say, that's fine, just tell me, so what if you see them? So down-regulating her worry that she was going mad. I said, no, you're not going mad, you're just seeing things, but just like seeing people on the road, why does it freak you out? And she began to use her psychic abilities in a healthy way and begin to discern what is her stuff and what isn't. And that discernment requires fine work, not just very crude, oh, well, we're just going to apply a practice here. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of work I was interested in, that kind of subtle, careful interface between ancestors that may come through and how they come through, because generally the ancestor voices are not hypercritical, brutal, horrible, sarcastic, demanding. Those are much more the typical psychotic negative voices. Ancestor voices are much more neutral, calm, quiet, and often have, if they have a challenge, they can, but the challenge is one of a kind challenge. Does that make sense?
What about intuition?
Well, it can be a download.
Be your ancestors speaking to you? You know what I mean?
Yep. You see, that depends on your model. For some, it's the ancestors. For some, it's a download from a spiritual realm. I don't care. What matters, how accurate is your intuition.
Right.
You see, that's what matters, is how clear are you as a channel to get useful information. A lot of people talk about having intuitions, and that's lovely, and how accurate is it? You see, and this is where I suppose I come from, the tradition where, yeah, we all do, so what? What are you going to do with it? How effective are you? How do you serve your community with it? Because I can talk about intuition all day, but it doesn't mean anything if it doesn't serve. So this is where I suppose in the Western world, it's just like a wow thing, but actually it isn't. It's just another form of accessing knowledge. And if it is useful and helpful, great. If it's vague and just naive and wrong, then it's important actually to look at what happened here. Why did I get this wrong? What was that state that might not have been so clear? Because people often don't wonder about, why did that not work? So I had to train, let's say when I was dancing, to find objects. We had to find objects. So what would happen, I would enter a trance state, and my teacher had hidden a matchstick in a metal pot in the kitchen somewhere. And I had to access that information, not by asking a question, but to say, it is wooden, I can see a match, and it's, east, and it's in a container out of metal. And he says, go fetch it. So if I didn't get that intuition or that voice right, it would show immediately. So the testing is what happens in this. So you see, this is where this is not just a little cute intuition. It is much more about training, mastery, because you're going to work with clients. It matters that you kind of be respectful of what's happening in that space. And in those communities where shamans train well, not all communities are equal in that way. you get a kind of a strong sense of testing and not being deeply moved by trance states. So people enter them, but what are you going to do with them?
Right. Oh my God, I could talk to you for hours.
Very kind.
Thank you so very much. And if people want to purchase your book, please let us know what the title of the book and where they can purchase and learn more about you.
Look, I suppose the easiest way is to go on Amazon. They'll find, with my name, Ingo Lambrecht, they'll find the Sangoma Trance States, Kindle or whatever. If you Google, just put my name in Google, there's various articles and book chapters I've written, both in quite a very clinical, in kind of formal articles in journals or in book chapters for mental health, but also in certain books for, more outside the psychological realm world of shamanism, and also in terms of aesthetics, I've written on art and trance states. So have a look and see what grabs you, and just see what interests you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.